Hey everybody, welcome back to another lesson as we continue our jaunt or journey or whatever we want to call it through the biblical narrative. This week we are looking at the story of Sarah and Hagar and Abraham, kicking off a portion of the Old Testament story known as the patriarchs. The patriarchs are some of the important early fathers is what we call them as we look back towards the very ancient history of the Jewish culture and the Jewish nation way back in Genesis. So first thing we're going to do is I'm going to have you do the opening prayer and check in with one another with your normal highs and lows. So I am going to flip us over here, and here is the prayer. So you can put me on pause. You can pray this prayer together as your families, share those highs and lows. And then once you get that done, then unpause and come on back. So go ahead and do that. Okay, I'm going to trust that you have done that now. So we'll pull ourselves off the share and get back into normal. So a recap of what we have covered so far. I know we're a few weeks into this whole gig now. We really have not gotten very far. We're only a few chapters into the book of Genesis, which of course is the first book of the Bible. But so far we've talked about how God made it somehow, and then humanity messed it up somehow. And then about 10 generations went by, and God was grieving having created humanity because things have gotten so not great. And so we have Noah and the flood, and post-flood, God has made the promise to never, ever destroy the earth by flood again. Makes that one-sided covenant with Noah and with humanity, and displays God's ongoing mercy. So that is what we have had so far. Now we are going to fast forward a couple of chapters in the book of Genesis and about a dozen or so odd generations post-flood. About the only story that's present in this part that we are skipping over besides genealogy is the story of the Tower of Babel. Now what happens in that situation is the people are all kind of still one big people group, and they decide we're going to build a tower all the way to heaven and we can say hi to God. And God's like, oh, that's cute. No, I don't think so. And so God somehow takes one language and this one group of people and scatters them into different people, different groups, different cultures with different languages and all this stuff. Everything kind of gets messed up. So that's kind of the one story we have, and then genealogy, like I said. Also, we talked last time when we talked about genealogy that people lived a really long time. Now, post-flood, people are not living so long. If you want to take a glance at Genesis chapter 11, you can kind of see that. From here, we are arriving at the story of Abraham, or as he is initially called, Abram. Same guy, different names. Have you heard the story? I'm going to introduce it with, or not the story, excuse me, the song, Father Abraham. Maybe you've heard it. Father Abraham had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham, and I am one of them, and so were you. So let's all praise the Lord. Right hand, left hand, and all kinds of stuff. I don't know. Maybe you heard that when you were in Sunday school. Maybe you didn't. If not, you probably are laughing at me because I'm doing weird things. But anyway, who are the children of Abraham? Who do you think? Typically, we think of the children of Abraham as being the Jewish culture or the Jewish nation, or at least kind of. But before you can have descendants, before you can have many children, you have to have children, right? And that's where we are going to pick up. Now, Abram, his name, actually, he pops up. I got to back up. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Abram first pops up right at the end of chapter 11 in that whole genealogy thing. He is the oldest son of a guy named Terah. He has a wife named Sarai. Again, we're going to have a name change there, Sarai to Sarah, just like Abram eventually becomes Abraham. We know that she is barren. That's basically all we know. And what we can infer is that his dad, Terah, is kind of a big deal. He's in charge of a clan or like a group of people. He's probably like, we could consider him like a local warlord. He's a person who's in charge of an area. And that's important in Abram's story because as Abram's is the oldest son to Terah, he has power and he has wealth and he has influence and he stands to inherit all of that and get all of that from his dad as the oldest son because he is the heir. So the last opening side note, I hinted at this a second ago, that with this whole name change thing. Remember, we talked about this already, that in Hebrew names usually mean something specific. Like think back to Adamah or Adam or Adam as we know it. Adam literally means mud dude or mud guy or mud person. And now Abram, same deal. Abram means high exalted father, which is a weird thing to call your kid when he's born, but oh well. But Abraham, which he'll get eventually, means father of many. Now, God's going to change his name eventually, something else that we will see. That's another one of those themes that we're going to continue to pick up on. Okay. First portion of reading. I want you to open up to Genesis chapter 12. And you're going to read verses 1 through 4. So put me on pause and read them. Okay. So we see that Abram is just kind of hanging out. He's in his father's household. He's with all of his father's people. He's got stability. He's got influence. He's got all of that going for him. And God shows up and basically says, go, and I'll tell you when you get there. And Abraham's like, okay, sounds good. And off he goes. Question. I want you to pause and write this down. Talk about this, write it down. What else does God promise or tell Abram besides just go in this portion? Go ahead and talk about that. Okay, now I want you to skip ahead a few verses. We're going to pick up at verse 10 and read verses 10 through 20. In the little gap that we have, basically, we hear that Abraham or Abe, I tend to call him Abe and Sarah and Abe's nephew Lot, they leave and they just kind of go and they wander. Now, I want you to keep in mind, at this point, Abe is already 75 years old, so he's not exactly a spring chicken. Remember that promise of God's blessing? Kind of seems like Abe forgets about it, right? Oh, if you haven't read that portion, 10 through 20, go ahead and pause and do that now. Okay, so it seems like God has sort of forgotten, or not God, Abe has sort of forgotten about this whole idea that God's going to bless me. He's also a bit of a liar. He benefits financially from this whole situation with his sister and Pharaoh. It's kind of not a cool thing. Seems like a real nice dude, right? He pretty much pawned off his wife and benefited financially from it. And even worse, this isn't the only time he does it. He'll actually do it again later on in the story. But isn't Abe supposed to be the good guy? He is, right? Remember what we talked about with Noah last week? That theme, that emerging theme that God uses imperfect people. Well, guess what? Same deal with Abraham. Okay. Over the course of the next 3 chapters, he keeps on wandering, other stuff happening, keeps happening. God keeps on blessing him. Things are going well for him, even though he's just sort of wandering. But that whole I'm going to make you into a great nation thing, we haven't really gotten any, we haven't made up any ground on that. We haven't made much progress. So now we're going to skip ahead a few chapters. We're going to go to chapter 15. And in this gap, it's been about 10 years. So now Abe is about 85-ish. I want you to read chapter 15, verses 1 through 6. Put me on pause, do that. Okay. So Abe basically reminds God, hey, God, remember that promise that you made me? Question, and I want you to write this down. How does God respond? And then how does Abraham respond to God? What do we see in this back and forth? Talk about that. And then come back off pause. Okay, side note to that. If you heard the word faith before, it's one that we throw around in church a lot. But what does it mean? Basically, I think the word faith means that believing that you believe that God is going to say what God says he'll do. And that sort of sounds like Abe, right? That kind of sounds like what we have going on here. Abe believes God, even when it doesn't make any sense. And it's credited as righteousness. That's how we hear that. But I call this faith. Faith is believing that God's going to make good on the promises. Okay, another year goes by. Skip ahead to 16, verses 1 through 10. Go ahead and pause and read that. Okay, so now basically Abe and Sarah have decided that they're going to quit waiting on God. Now, what you need to know about her, she's also old. She's only about 10 years younger than Abraham. So she's quite advanced in age as well. And they decide to quit waiting for God to do something and take matters into their own hands. Now, here's where things get a little dicey. We got Hagar. Hagar is a slave of Sarai. And she basically says, I'm going to give you my slave and she will become your wife. Now, this is weird. It doesn't happen for us now, but it used to happen all the time there. It was really, really quite common. Hagar then gets pregnant. She's a wife. She's kind of a second wife, but she's a wife, and she gets pregnant. Side note, do you think she had any say in this whatsoever? Probably not, right? So here's a question. I want you to think about this, talk about this, and write this down. How do you think she feels about this whole deal? Especially having no power in the situation. How do you like? Is she just like, oh, okay, that sounds good, or what do you think? I mean, we don't know. It's not described for us, but how do you think she probably feels about this whole deal? Talk about that, and then come on back. Um, okay, now you're back. So following this whole deal, now that Hagar is pregnant, Sarai decides that maybe she doesn't like this idea quite so much, and she begins to butt heads with Hagar. They really start to butt heads. Hagar actually runs off. She runs away. An angel of the Lord shows up and gives her some assurance that no, this is okay. We want you to stay put, and she comes back. Interestingly enough, she even gives God a name. She's one of the very few people who names God and just says, this is the God who sees me. It's kind of a very rare situation, but a cool one. A little bit of time goes by. Hagar has a son. They name him Ishmael. So now, hey, great. Abram's got a kid. That means everything's off and running, right? Or does it? Okay. At this point, we fast forward another roughly 13 years. Abraham is pushing 100 years old. I want you to put me on pause and read chapter 17, verses 1 through 8. Go ahead. All right. So now we have heard that God shows up again, reminds Abram of the promise, gives him the name change. So now he's actually Abraham. So we see that name change. He establishes a covenant with Abe, kind of like Noah, but a little bit different this time. With Noah, it was one-sided. Remember, we talked about that right at the beginning of the video, that humanity didn't have to do anything. The covenant was only on the part of God. Now there's a sign and there's something that God asks of humanity, specifically the guys, and that's circumcision. And if you don't know what circumcision is, go ahead and talk about it. Ouch. Okay. Now read verses 15 through 22. Be on pause, do that. Okay. We have the name change for Sarai. She becomes Sarah, as we really kind of know her. A reminder of the covenant that's going to happen through her son, who she doesn't have yet. But Abe has some concerns. He says to God, you know what? I'm old. She's old. I've already got a kid. What do we do with that? Well, God gives him some reassurance. That's all happening in this. We're going to skip ahead again. Chapter 18, verses 11 through 15. Put me on pause. Read that. So now Sarah, she doesn't really believe things either. And yet, a year later, now skip ahead again. We got a lot of really rapid skips going on here. Now we're going to go ahead to chapter 21, verses 1 through 7. Go ahead and pause and read that. Okay. After all these years, it's been 25 years since God showed up to Abe in the first place, made this promise, not to mention the previous 75 years of life that he had lived ahead of that. Finally, the child of the promise, the child of God's promise arrives in Isaac. But what about Ishmael? What about him? He's still Abe's kid, right? Put me on pause and read 8 through 21. Okay. Ishmael is also blessed because he is a child of Abraham. His descendants would eventually would go on to something that we could call the Nation of Islam. His descendants eventually, many centuries later, even like 6 or 7 or 800 years after Jesus, his descendants would go on to be the beginning of the Nation of Islam, or the Islamic faith, or the Muslim faith. So that would all happen. So question for you, and I want you to talk about this. What's significant about that? Think about this idea. The interfaith struggles that go on between Jewish people and Christian people and Muslim people could be considered a family squabble. Why? Talk about that, write that down. I want you to share that. Okay. So folks, that's pretty much what I have for you today. And admittedly, I didn't have a whole ton of questions that I wanted you to answer. There was a couple of them, 2 or 3 in there. But as we wrap things up, I want you to share, write down your general thoughts about this, or any questions that you might have, or concerns that you might have given this whole thing. What do you think? What seems significant? What seems important? What seems confusing to you? That's what we've got for today. Go ahead and share those things. Get them sent off to me when you can. and look for that next week with the response, as we've been doing. As we are looking ahead, we're going to stay in this period of the patriarchs, and we're not going to fast forward very far. We're going to look at the next couple of generations post Abraham as we are moving forward, and we're beginning to see the expansion through Isaac of the beginning of this great nation that God is going to make. Thanks, everybody.